In the grim darkness of the far future, where even the stars themselves cry out in chains of gravity and time, there exists a truth so fundamental that to speak it is to court madness. There is no such thing as an orc prison. There are only cages that haven't been smashed yet. Listen, if you dare, to the sound that haunts the void between worlds, a sound that echoes through the whole bones of dead ships and the forgotten corridors of abandoned stations. It is laughter. Deep, resonant, and utterly alien. It carries on solar winds and whispers through the warp, a constant reminder that somewhere in this galaxy of endless war, creatures exist who find joy in the very thing that destroys us all. The concept of confinement is a human delusion, born from our desperate need to believe that chaos can be ordered, that violence can be contained, that the fundamental forces of destruction can be held behind bars of adamantium and hope. We build our prisons not to hold our enemies, but to hold our fear of them. We craft elaborate systems of restraint not because they work, but because we need them to work, because without them, we would have to face the truth that we are not the masters of this universe. In the bureaucratic halls of the Adeptus Mechanicus, where ledgers grow thick with the blood of the innocent and forms are filed in triplicate for every breath drawn in service to the Emperor, there exists a classification, Xenos Containment Protocol 7 Alpha. It is a designation that appears on manifests and duty rosters, stamped with the seal of necessity and filed under essential services. But those who work within this classification know its true name, whispered in the recycled air of transport vessels and scrawled in the margins of incident reports: the impossible task. The atmosphere grows heavy here, in this space between worlds where metal groans under pressure and the very air tastes of machine oil and desperation. Somewhere in the distance, carried on currents of filtered atmosphere, comes that sound again, laughter that seems to originate from the walls themselves, as if the ship's hull has learned to find humor in its own decay. It is a wet sound, organic and mechanical simultaneously, like gears grinding through flesh. But routine never lasts in the Imperium, and those who serve within its most classified installations learn quickly that normal is merely a pause between catastrophes. Deep in the heart of a dead asteroid, carved from rock that has known neither sun nor atmosphere for millennia, stands Installation Tertius 9, a fortress of solitude floating in the void like a metal tumor on the galaxy's flesh. Here, where the Emperor's light struggles to penetrate through layers of plasteel and prayer, the Imperium conducts its most futile work, the containment of the uncontainable. The corridors stretch endlessly, illuminated by lumen strips that flicker with the uncertainty of failing power systems. Each light casts shadows that seem to move independently, creating a dance of darkness across walls stained with the accumulated grime of centuries. The air recycling systems wheeze and mutter, pushing atmosphere thick with the scent of industrial lubricant, ozone from overloaded power cells, and something else, something organic and earthy that shouldn't exist in this sterile environment but persists nonetheless, like a memory of soil and growing things. Servitors shuffle through these passages on legs that were once human, their augmetic systems humming with the barely contained electricity of the Omnissiah's will. They carry data slates and cleaning implements, their lobotomized minds focused on tasks that have been performed the same way for generations: record, document, maintain. Their flesh is pale and waxy, their remaining organic components preserved in a state somewhere between life and death, perfectly suited for an installation that exists in the space between hope and futility. In the command center, where banks of cogitators churn through endless streams of data, tech adepts maintain their vigil with religious precision. They chant binary hymns to machine spirits while monitoring vital signs that appear on screens in patterns of green light, heartbeats and brain activity translated into numbers that somehow make the impossible seem manageable. Each fluctuation is recorded, analyzed, and filed away in archives that grow larger with every passing day, as if documentation alone could somehow contain the chaos they guard. The cells themselves are marvels of Imperial engineering and testament to humanity's capacity for elaborate self-deception. Each containment unit is a perfect sphere of adamantium 3 meters in diameter, suspended within a chamber lined with psychic dampening materials and prayer-etched ceramite. Stasis fields hum with barely contained energy, creating distortions in the air that make reality itself seem uncertain. The temperature is kept precisely 7 degrees below human comfort, cold enough to slow biological functions but not cold enough to cause tissue damage, a balance maintained through calculations performed by some of the finest minds in the Mechanicus. But it is the prisoners themselves that truly define the impossible nature of this place. They are massive even in their enforced slumber, green-skinned giants whose flesh seems to pulse with a vitality that defies their sedated state. Restraint cables thick as a man's waist bind limbs that could crush ceramite, while neural inhibitors feed a constant stream of pacification chemicals directly into their bloodstream. Their skin glistens with a sheen of industrial lubricant and restraint gel, giving them the appearance of specimens preserved in some cosmic laboratory. Even unconscious, their faces bear expressions of savage joy. Even drugged into near catatonia, their lips curl in smiles that speak of violence and victory. The monitoring equipment registers dreams filled with gunfire and explosions, with the clash of metal against metal and the roar of engines modified beyond all reason. Sleep, for an orc, is not escape from war, it is merely war experienced in a different dimension. The guards speak in hushed tones of the sounds that emerge from the cells during the deepest hours of the duty cycle, when the installation's lights dim to their lowest setting and the corridors fill with shadows thick enough to hide in. They report chanting in a language that exists somewhere between bestial roars and mechanical grinding, voices raised in what might be songs of battle or prayers to gods of destruction. The recordings are analyzed, cataloged, and filed away with notations that grow more desperate with each incident report, linguistic analysis inconclusive. Recommend increased sedation levels. Request additional psychic dampening measures. Yet beneath the surface, something began to stir, something that monitoring equipment couldn't detect and that prayer-etched walls couldn't contain. To understand the true horror of orc imprisonment, one must first comprehend what passes for thought in minds that exist as living weapons. The human concept of captivity assumes consciousness operates within familiar parameters: memory, anticipation, the psychological weight of confinement pressing against the soul like water against a dam. But orc consciousness is fungal, distributed, and fundamentally alien to everything we consider normal. In the depths of their sedated dreams, the creatures contained within Installation Tertius 9 experience no sense of being trapped. Their minds, such as they are, exist in a constant state of warfare that transcends physical boundaries. While their bodies remain bound by adamantium and electricity, their psychic essence reaches out through the warp, connecting to the vast network of orc consciousness that spans the galaxy like a green cancer growing through reality's flesh. Dr. Cornelius Vex, the installation's chief xenobiologist, has spent 17 years studying the specimens, and his reports read like the journals of a man slowly descending into madness. His early entries speak of scientific curiosity and the thrill of discovery. His recent work consists largely of question marks and fragmentary observations that trail off into unintelligible scribbles. Day 6247. The EEG readings show patterns that shouldn't be possible. Neural activity suggests complex strategic thinking during deep sedation. How are they planning battles while unconscious? The truth, had Dr. Vex possessed the wisdom to understand it, is that orcs don't plan in the human sense. They exist in a state of perpetual readiness for war, their genetic memory filled with the accumulated violence of their species stretching back through eons of conflict. Even bound and drugged, they participate in battles that rage across distant worlds, their psychic field reaching through dimensions to touch their kind wherever violence blooms. The installation's psychic monitoring equipment registers fluctuations that correspond to major orc campaigns throughout the sector. When whack! Scarjaw tears through the Calixis sector, the prisoner's neural activity spikes to levels that should be impossible given their sedation. When freebooters raid the shipping lanes around Vostroya, the containment fields experience power fluctuations that require constant recalibration. The connection is undeniable, yet it defies every law of physics and psychic theory known to Imperial science. Guard Captain Marcus Thorne, a veteran of 30 years' service in the Imperial Guard before his assignment to Installation Tertius 9, has developed an understanding of the prisoners that exists beyond the realm of scientific study. In his private logs, sealed away from official review, he describes the sensation of being watched by creatures whose eyes remain closed, of feeling their attention like a physical weight pressing against his mind during his rounds. They know things, he writes in shaking script. Things they couldn't possibly know. When Guard Korvac broke his leg in Corridor 7, the prisoner's vital signs spiked before the accident report was even filed. When supply vessel Meridian was delayed by warp storms 3 sectors away, they started laughing 6 hours before we received the delayed arrival notification. It's as if they can see through the walls, through space itself, into events that haven't happened yet. The laughter is the worst part, not because it's loud, but because it's joyful. Human prisoners rage against their confinement, or they sink into despair, or they plot escape with the desperate cunning of the trapped. But orcs laugh with genuine mirth, as if their imprisonment is merely the setup to some cosmic joke whose punchline they alone understand. The sound echoes through the ventilation systems, distorted by distance and machinery until it becomes part of the installation's ambient noise, a constant reminder that the predators dream of hunting even while wrapped in chains. Dr. Vek's final coherent report, filed just days before he was found in his laboratory speaking to the walls in what sounded like Orcish, contained a single observation that chilled everyone who read it. I believe we are not studying prisoners. We are studying weapons that allow themselves to be held because they find our efforts amusing. They could break free at any moment. They choose not to. The question that haunts me is, why? What seemed ordinary soon revealed its true horror as the installation's crew began to realize they were not guards, but unwitting participants in an experiment whose parameters they could not comprehend. It began, as most catastrophes do, with something small, a single lumen strip in Corridor Epsilon 7 that flickered 3 times in rapid succession at 3:47 during the night watch. Guard Korvac noted it in his patrol log with the mechanical precision of a man accustomed to equipment failures. Lumen Array 7E23 requires maintenance. Intermittent failure, probable power coupling issue. The maintenance request was filed in triplicate, stamped, and queued for processing by Servitor Unit 7 Maintenance, which would inspect the lights sometime within the next 72 hours according to standard protocol. In the meantime, Korvac continued his rounds, his footsteps echoing through corridors that seemed somehow different in that flickering light, shadows that moved wrong, corners that appeared deeper than they should be, air that tasted faintly of something green and growing. By 5 o'clock, Korvac had failed to report in from Checkpoint Delta. His Vox remained active, transmitting the steady carrier signal that indicated his equipment was functional, but his voice had gone silent. Command assumed equipment malfunction, a common enough occurrence in an installation where ancient systems struggled against the corrosive effects of time and neglect. A replacement guard was dispatched to complete the patrol route and locate Korvac for equipment inspection. They found his gear at Checkpoint Delta, arranged with military precision, Lasker being propped against the wall, ammunition pack placed beside it, helmet positioned carefully on the floor. His uniform had been folded and stacked nearby, creating a perfect display of abandoned duty. The only sign of disturbance was the recording device in his Vox unit, which had captured 43 minutes of audio after his last official report. The recording began normally: footsteps, the hum of ventilation systems, the distant mechanical sounds that form the soundtrack of every Imperial installation. But at timestamp 4:12, something changed. The footsteps stopped, and for 17 seconds there was perfect silence. Then came Korvac's voice, speaking in a tone of wonder that was completely unlike his usual professional demeanor. "Emperor's teeth, is that? How are you?" The rest was static, punctuated by what the analysis team initially classified as equipment interference, bursts of sound that seemed to follow patterns without quite resolving into anything recognizable. But Guard Captain Thorne, listening to the recording for the 7th time in his office while staring at Korvac's empty duty station, heard something else in those static bursts. They sounded like laughter, distorted through distance and electronics but unmistakably joyful, as if someone had told the universe's greatest joke and the cosmos itself was responding with mirth. The incident report filed by Sergeant Vance was a masterpiece of bureaucratic understatement. Guard Korvac absent from duty without notification. Personal effects located at final checkpoint. No signs of struggle or forced entry. Recommend disciplinary review upon Korvac's return to duty. But beneath the official language, everyone who worked the night shift knew that Korvac wasn't coming back, and more importantly, they knew he hadn't left through any door or airlock that could be monitored. Within 48 hours, other signs of disturbance began to manifest throughout the installation. The maintenance servitors reported unusual organic matter accumulating in the ventilation shafts, not decay or contamination, but something that resembled plant growth. Microscopic analysis revealed structures that shouldn't exist in the sterile environment of an asteroid-based facility: spore formations, root-like filaments, and cellular matrices that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. The atmospheric recycling systems began working harder to maintain air quality standards, their filters clogging more frequently than their specifications suggested possible. The recycled air carried new scents: earth after rain, growing leaves, and something else that reminded the installation's botanist, before she was transferred to other duties, of a greenhouse in full bloom. But there were no plants on installation Tertius 9, no soil, no possibility of natural growth. Dr. Vex emerged from his laboratory after 3 days of continuous research to deliver a report that sent chills through the command staff. The organic matter, he explained, was fungal in nature but unlike any Earth-based organism in Imperial databases. It displayed characteristics of both plant and animal life, with cellular structures that defied standard biological categories. Most disturbing was its apparent ability to grow without any discernible energy source, as if it drew nourishment from something that existed beyond the physical realm. The growth patterns, Dr. Vex reported, his voice carrying the tremor of a man confronting truths that challenged his understanding of reality, suggest purposeful expansion rather than random spread. The organisms are not simply growing, they are building something. Creating pathways. Establishing connections between different areas of the installation. It's as if they're constructing a nervous system using our ventilation shafts as neural pathways. The temperature began to rise, degree by degree, despite the environmental controls operating at maximum efficiency. Humidity increased, turning the normally dry corridors into spaces where breath misted and metal surfaces grew slick with condensation. The installation, built to maintain the sterile environment necessary for containing dangerous specimens, began to feel alive, as if the asteroid itself had developed a pulse and was breathing around them. Tech Adept Zal's machine spirits began reporting anomalies in the containment systems, minor fluctuations in power output, microscopic variations in stasis field integrity, and psychic dampening arrays that required constant recalibration to maintain effectiveness. Each anomaly was within acceptable parameters when viewed individually, but together they painted a picture of systematic degradation that no amount of maintenance could address. The prisoners remained motionless in their cells, but their vital signs showed increasing activity. Heart rates that had been artificially suppressed began approaching normal ranges despite maximum sedation. Brainwave patterns shifted from the flat lines of chemical unconsciousness to the complex rhythms of REM sleep, then to patterns that resembled active consciousness. Most unnervingly, they had begun to synchronize, 6 separate nervous systems displaying identical neural activity, as if they shared a single mind distributed across multiple bodies. Yet beneath the surface, something began to stir that was far more dangerous than escaped prisoners or failing containment systems: the growing realization among the installation's crew that they had never been in control of anything at all. Inquisitor Gaius Malachar arrived aboard the strike cruiser Purity's Edge exactly 17 hours after the facility's distress beacon activated, though the crew of Installation Tertius 9 had sent no distress call. His ship materialized from the warp with the precision of divine providence, as if the Emperor himself had guided their passage through the immaterium to arrive at this moment of crisis. The Inquisitor's presence filled the docking bay like pressure from a storm front, a tall figure wrapped in the black robes of his office, servo skulls orbiting his head like metallic saints, and eyes that seemed to catalog sins with every glance. His retinue disembarked with the mechanical precision of the absolutely faithful, 2 Astartes in the colors of the Death Cult, their armor bearing the scars of 100 purges, a tech priest whose augmetics had replaced so much flesh that he resembled a walking shrine to the Omnicia, and a psyker bound in sanctified chains, her eyes covered by blindfolds inscribed with prayers in 17 different languages. They moved through the installation's corridors like antibodies through infected tissue, their purpose absolute and their methods beyond question. Guard Captain Thorne met them at Airlock 7, his dress uniform pressed and his bearing rigidly correct despite the exhaustion that lined his face like cracks in parchment. The Inquisitor studied him for a long moment before speaking, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had pronounced sentence on entire worlds. "Captain Thorne, your facility has been compromised. I am here to determine whether this compromise represents negligence, heresy, or simple incompetence." The briefing took place in the installation's primary conference chamber, where holographic displays showed the facility's layout in 3-dimensional detail. The Inquisitor listened to each report with the patience of a man accustomed to cataloging failure, his servo skulls recording every word while their red sensors swept the room like the eyes of predators. Dr. Vex presented his biological findings, his hands shaking as he described the impossible growth spreading through their ventilation systems. Tech Adept Saul delivered his mechanical assessments with binary precision, each system failure translated into probabilities and risk factors that painted a picture of inevitable catastrophe. When the presentations concluded, Inquisitor Malachar stood and began to pace, his robes rustling like the wings of carrion birds. His words carried the weight of imperial doctrine, each syllable pronounced with the certainty of absolute truth. "Gentlemen, you labor under a fundamental misunderstanding of your purpose here. You believe you are guards, keepers of dangerous specimens contained for study and analysis. This is incorrect. You are priests in a temple dedicated to humanity's greatest virtue, the ability to impose order upon chaos." He gestured toward the holographic display showing the facility's detention levels, where 6 containment cells held their impossible prisoners. These creatures represent everything that stands opposed to human civilization. They are chaos given flesh, destruction incarnate, the antithesis of everything the Emperor has built. Your duty is not merely to contain them, it is to prove that human will, backed by imperial technology and imperial faith, can cage the uncageable. The Inquisitor's lecture continued for 2 hours, touching on theological concepts that stretched back to the earliest days of the Imperium. He spoke of containment as a form of prayer, of surveillance as a sacred duty, of the psychological necessity of maintaining the illusion that humanity controlled its destiny in a galaxy that sought constantly to prove otherwise. His words were sharp and formal, each sentence crafted like a weapon designed to cut through doubt and hesitation. "Every day that these specimens remain in custody," he proclaimed, "is a victory for human civilization. Every night that passes without incident is proof that the Emperors can overcome any obstacle. This facility is not merely a prison, it is a monument to the triumph of order over entropy, a beacon of hope in a galaxy where such hope is often all that stands between humanity and extinction." But even as he spoke, there were signs that his confidence was built on foundations less solid than he proclaimed. His servo skulls circled the room constantly, their sensors seeking threats that conventional wisdom suggested could not exist. The Psyker and his retinue had begun to twitch behind her sanctified blindfold, her lips moving in prayers that grew more desperate with each passing minute. The tech priest's augmetic sensors registered temperature fluctuations that should have been impossible in a climate-controlled environment. Dr. Vex, emboldened by exhaustion in proximity to someone who might actually possess answers, asked the question that had haunted him for months, "Inquisitor, if these creatures are truly contained, why do they laugh? Why do our instruments show neural activity consistent with active consciousness despite maximum sedation? Why do I have the feeling that they know something we don't?" The Inquisitor's response was swift and cutting. "Doctor, doubt is the first step toward heresy, and heresy is a luxury we cannot afford in this place. These creatures laugh because they are alien, and alien minds process captivity differently than human minds. They show neural activity because their biology operates on principles we do not fully understand. They know nothing that we do not permit them to know, because knowledge itself is subject to human will when that will is properly focused." Yet even as he delivered this rebuke, Inquisitor Malakar's eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty, a moment of recognition that his words sounded rehearsed, brittle, like parchment about to tear under pressure. The doctrine he preached was perfect in theory, but theory had never been tested against prisoners who dreamed of battles fought on distant worlds, who synchronized their biological functions across separate containment cells, who somehow knew things that happened beyond the walls of their prison. The meeting concluded with new security protocols, additional prayer services, and enhanced monitoring procedures that would theoretically address every weakness the Inquisitor had identified. But as the participants filed out of the conference room, each carrying orders that would reshape their daily routines around even more elaborate systems of control, none of them noticed that the air had grown warmer, that the walls seemed to pulse with a rhythm like a vast heartbeat, or that the lights throughout the facility had begun to flicker in patterns that almost resembled laughter. What seemed like reinforcement soon revealed its true nature as the final act of a performance whose audience had never been human at all. The changes accelerated after the Inquisitor's arrival, as if his presence had somehow catalyzed processes that had been building beneath the surface of normality. Within 6 hours of his inspection, the installation's environmental systems began reporting anomalies that couldn't be explained by mechanical failure or human error. The temperature rose 3 degrees despite the cooling systems operating at maximum efficiency. Humidity spiked to levels that turned breath into visible mist and caused condensation to stream down the walls in patterns that resembled root systems spreading through soil. The fungal growth that Dr. Vex had identified in the ventilation shafts underwent explosive expansion, transforming from microscopic spores into visible formations that pulsed with their own bioluminescent glow. Maintenance teams sent to clear the contamination reported structures that resembled both plant roots and neural pathways, organic cables that stretched through the facility's infrastructure like a secondary nervous system parallel to the installation's electronic networks. Tech-adept Zal's machine spirits began registering impossible readings throughout the facility's power grid. Electrical currents flowed in directions that defied the laws of physics, creating closed loops that generated more energy than they consumed. The facility's reactors reported output levels that exceeded their theoretical maximum capacity, yet power distribution systems showed signs of systematic drainage that seemed to flow into the walls themselves. In the detention levels, where adamantium cells held their impossible prisoners, the changes were most pronounced. The containment fields that had maintained perfect stability for years began to fluctuate in rhythms that corresponded to no known mechanical cycle. The psychic dampening arrays required constant recalibration as they struggled against emanations that grew stronger with each passing hour. Most disturbing was the sound, a low, seismic humming that seemed to emerge from the asteroid's stone itself, as if the rock around them had developed a voice. Guard Captain Thorne's patrol reports grew increasingly surreal as he documented phenomena that challenged his understanding of reality. Corridors that had been familiar for years now felt different, longer than they should be, with corners that seemed to bend space around them. Shadows moved independently of their light sources, creating the impression of movement in empty passages. The air itself seemed to thicken, carrying scents of earth and growing things that had no place in the sterile environment of an Imperial detention facility. The prisoners, still bound in their restraint systems and pumped full of sedatives that should have kept them unconscious for decades, began to show signs of awareness that terrified their guards. Their eyes remained closed, but their heads turned to track movement outside their cells. Their lips moved in what might have been words, but the language was unlike anything in Imperial databases, a mixture of mechanical grinding and organic sounds that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly in the bones of anyone who heard it. Dr. Vex's research team, working around the clock to understand the organic contamination spreading through their facility, made discoveries that shattered their understanding of biology itself. The fungal network wasn't simply growing, it was thinking. Neural pathway analysis revealed decision-making structures more complex than human brain tissue, distributed intelligence that operated on principles that existed beyond current scientific understanding. It's not contamination, Dr. Vex reported to the increasingly desperate command staff. It's communication. The growth patterns correspond to data transmission networks. These organisms are sharing information, coordinating their expansion, making collective decisions about how to modify their environment. They're turning our facility into an extension of themselves. The Inquisitor's response was swift and absolute: increased prayer services, enhanced security protocols, and purification rituals that filled the corridors with incense smoke and chanted litanies. But even as his retinue performed their sanctified duties, the changes continued to accelerate. The servo-skulls that orbited his head began malfunctioning, their flight patterns becoming erratic as their machine spirits struggled against interference that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The installation's crew reported dreams filled with sounds of battle, the roar of engines modified beyond reason, the thunder of weapons that turned destruction into art, the voices of warriors raised in songs of joy and violence. They woke exhausted, as if they had spent their sleeping hours participating in conflicts fought on distant worlds. Most disturbing was the growing realization that these dreams felt more real than their waking hours, more vital than the sterile routines that filled their days. In the facility's central control room, where banks of monitors displayed vital signs from the detention cells, technicians watched in fascination and terror as 6 separate nervous systems achieved perfect synchronization. Heart rates matched to the millisecond. Brainwave patterns became identical across all specimens. Respiratory cycles aligned so precisely that the 6 prisoners seemed to breathe with a single set of lungs distributed across multiple bodies. The laughter began at 1547 station time, emerging from the detention levels as a sound so deep and resonant that it seemed to make the asteroid itself vibrate. It was not the laughter of madness or desperation, it was the laughter of warriors who had discovered that their enemy's greatest strength was actually their greatest weakness, the mirth of predators who had realized that their prey had trapped themselves in a cage of their own making. The walls began to pulse with faint green light that followed the pathways of the fungal network, creating patterns that resembled neural activity or perhaps arterial flow. The facility's structure, built from the most advanced materials known to Imperial science, had become something organic, a living system that breathed and thought and prepared for something that human minds couldn't comprehend. The pressure was unbearable now, the sense of something vast and patient finally deciding that the time had come to act. The installation groaned around them like a living thing stretching after a long sleep, and everyone who worked within its walls knew with absolute certainty that whatever was coming next would transform everything they thought they understood about the nature of containment, control, and the futility of human ambition in a galaxy that belonged to gods of war. At 1923 station time, the impossible became inevitable. The first containment field failed not with the violent overload that Imperial engineers had anticipated, but with something far more unsettling. It simply switched off, as if the machinery had decided that its purpose was no longer relevant. The alarm klaxons that should have immediately activated remained silent, their circuits overridden by the facility's own systems. Only the soft whisper of atmospheric recyclers and the distant hum of the power grid marked the moment when humanity's greatest fear became reality. Prisoner 1 opened his eyes for the first time in 7 years of captivity, and reality shuddered around him like water disturbed by a stone. His pupils dilated in the dim light of his cell, focusing with predatory precision on the observation camera mounted in the ceiling. For 17 seconds, he stared directly into the lens, and every human being monitoring the detention levels felt the weight of that gaze like a physical pressure against their minds. Then he smiled, revealing teeth filed to points, and began to laugh. The sound that emerged from his throat was not the subdued chuckling that had haunted the facility's ventilation systems for months. This was laughter in its purest form, the joy of a warrior born for battle finally given the opportunity to practice his art. It reverberated through the cell's walls, through the corridors beyond, through the very bones of the asteroid itself, as if the stone remembered what it felt like to be a weapon and was eager to serve that purpose again. The restraint cables that bound his limbs, adamantium-enhanced polymer designed to hold a space marine in full armor, snapped like rotted rope. The neural inhibitors that had flooded his system with pacification chemicals for years found no purchase in blood that ran thick with fungal symbiotes. The psychic dampening field that surrounded his cell flickered and died as his mind reached out to touch intelligences that spanned the galaxy, drawing strength from every battle fought by his kind across the stars. He stood slowly, savoring the sensation of movement after years of enforced stillness, his massive frame filling the cell like violence given physical form. The restraint gel that had coated his skin for years cracked and fell away in sheets, revealing flesh that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that matched the fungal networks growing through the facility's walls. He was no longer a prisoner contained by human technology, he was a weapon that had allowed itself to be studied, a predator that had learned everything it needed to know about its captor's weaknesses. The second containment failure occurred 37 seconds later, followed by the third, fourth, fifth, and sixth in rapid succession. The installation's detention levels filled with the sound of snapping metal and overloading circuits as 6 apocalypses unfolded simultaneously. But it was the laughter that truly marked the end of human control, 6 voices raised in harmonious mirth that transformed the sterile corridors into an amphitheater of joy and violence. In the central control room, technicians watched their monitoring equipment fail in cascading waves as the prisoners' psychic emanations overloaded every system designed to observe them. The last coherent reading showed neural activity levels that exceeded human theoretical maximums, heart rates that should have been incompatible with life, and bioelectric field generation that turned each prisoner into a walking electromagnetic pulse weapon. Guard Captain Thorne led the first response team toward the detention levels, his lasker being charged and his combat armor sealed against biological contamination. Behind him came 12 veteran guards, men who had served on battlefields across the Imperium and faced enemies that would break lesser minds. They advanced through corridors that had become alien, where walls pulsed with organic light and the air itself seemed to thicken with anticipation. They found the first body at Checkpoint Gamma, or what remained of it. Guard Korvac had returned, transformed by his week-long absence into something that retained human shape but had abandoned human limitations. His flesh had merged with the fungal networks that lined the walls, creating a hybrid being that served as a living extension of the prisoner's will. He spoke in a voice that combined human vocal cords with something that sounded like grinding gears. "They want to meet you properly now." The battle that followed lasted 14 minutes and redefined everyone's understanding of what constituted overwhelming force. The escaped prisoners didn't fight like the tactical simulations had predicted. They fought like forces of nature given intelligence and humor. They moved through the facility's corridors with the casual confidence of apex predators returning to familiar hunting grounds, their laughter echoing from surfaces that had never known such sounds. Inquisitor Malachar attempted to coordinate the defense from the command center, his authority absolute and his faith unwavering even as everything he believed about containment and control crumbled around him. He ordered purging fire that would cleanse the facility of contamination, deployed servoskulls loaded with sanctified explosives, and activated emergency protocols that should have sealed the installation until reinforcements could arrive. None of it mattered. The prisoners moved through lost fire like it was rain, their enhanced physiology shrugging off wounds that would have killed normal humans. The facility's security systems, compromised by months of fungal infiltration, turned against their human operators. Blast doors sealed randomly, trapping guards in corridors that had become slaughter galleries. Environmental controls began pumping pure oxygen into areas where the prisoners fought, turning their weapons into incendiary devices that painted the walls with fire and blood. Dr. Vek's final research log, discovered days later among the ruins, provided the most accurate analysis of what had occurred. We were never containing them. We were nurturing them. Every security measure we implemented taught them about our weaknesses. Every biological sample we analyzed gave them insight into our physiology. Every day we kept them prisoner was a day they spent learning how to transform our own facility into a weapon against us. The laughter grew louder as the installation's crew was systematically eliminated, each death adding to a symphony of destruction that had been years in the making. The sounds of battle, screaming metal, overloading circuits, human voices raised in terror and confusion, provided accompaniment to the joyous roars of beings who had finally been given the opportunity to practice their life's work without restraint. But perhaps most terrifying was the growing realization among the few survivors that the prisoners weren't trying to escape. They were performing, demonstrating their art for an audience that existed beyond the physical boundaries of the installation. Every death was choreographed, every moment of destruction crafted with the precision of master artisans who understood that true artistry lay not in the destination but in the journey itself. The facility's final automated transmission, sent as the installation's power systems overloaded and died, contained only sound, 6 voices raised in harmonious laughter that somehow managed to convey satisfaction, completion, and anticipation for the next performance in venues yet to be discovered across the galaxy. Silence fell over Installation Tertius 9 at 23:47 station time, but it was not the silence of death, it was the silence of completion, the pause that follows a perfectly executed symphony. The facility's corridors, painted with the abstract art of violence and decorated with the twisted remains of what had once been humanity's most sophisticated containment technology, bore witness to a truth that imperial doctrine had never been designed to accommodate. Some things cannot be caged because they exist beyond the concept of captivity itself. The emergency beacon continued to transmit its distress signal into the void, An automated plea for rescue that would eventually bring salvage teams to catalog the wreckage and file reports that would disappear into the labyrinthine archives of the Administratum. But the installation itself had become something unprecedented in Imperial records, a monument to the fundamental futility of human ambition when confronted with forces that operated according to laws that existed beyond human understanding. In the ruins of the Central Command Center, where banks of monitoring equipment had been transformed into modern art installations of twisted metal and melted circuits, a single recording device continued to function. Its memory banks contained the final words of Inquisitor Gaius Malachar, delivered in a voice that had lost all traces of the absolute authority that had once defined his character. Personal log, Inquisitor Malachar, final entry. The containment protocols have failed. The security measures have failed. The faith itself appears to have failed. The recording continued in halting phrases punctuated by sounds that analysis would later classify as structural collapse, but which conveyed something more profound: the sound of certainty crumbling, of worldviews built on foundations of sand finally acknowledging their own instability. I have served the Emperor for 43 years. I have purged heretics on 17 worlds. I have faced the horrors of the warp and emerged victorious through faith and firepower. But this was never about containment. This was about proving to ourselves that we could contain the uncontainable. We built these walls not to keep them in, but to keep ourselves believing that such a thing was possible. Static interrupted the transmission for 47 seconds, during which automated sound analysis detected what might have been laughter, not the boisterous roars that had accompanied the facility's destruction, but something quieter, more contemplative, as if the universe itself was offering commentary on the scene. When Malachar's voice returned, it carried a tone of revelation that was more terrifying than any scream. Perhaps they were never the prisoners. Perhaps we were always the ones in chains, chained to our delusions, our desperate need to believe that human will could impose order on a cosmos that exists in a state of perpetual war. The philosophical implications of the facility's destruction would occupy Imperial theologians for generations, though most of their work would remain classified at levels that ensured it would never influence official doctrine. The fundamental question, whether imprisonment was measured in physical restraints or in the limitations of perception, challenged core assumptions about humanity's place in the galaxy and the nature of control itself. Technical analysis of the facilities remains revealed that the prisoners had indeed escaped, but not in any conventional sense. They had simply left, departing through methods that bypass conventional understanding of space and travel. The facility's hull remained intact, its airlock sealed, its structural integrity uncompromised. Yet the detention cells were empty, containing only the residual energy signatures of beings who had chosen to exist elsewhere. More troubling were the reports filed by the eventual salvage teams, whose members described dreams filled with sounds of distant battle and sensations of movement through spaces that existed beyond normal geometry. Several team members requested immediate transfer to other duties after completing their surveys, citing personal reasons that they declined to elaborate upon in their official statements. The facility's biological contamination had not been eliminated by the violence that destroyed its crew. It had evolved, transforming into something that existed in symbiosis with the installation's technological systems. The fungal networks continued to pulse with bioluminescent activity, but their patterns had changed. Instead of the chaotic growth that had preceded the breakout, they now displayed organization that resembled art more than biology, elegant spirals in geometric forms that conveyed meaning without requiring language to interpret. Dr. Vek's research materials, scattered throughout his laboratory like the fragments of a shattered philosophy, contained his final theoretical framework for understanding what had occurred. Scrawled across whiteboards and handwriting that grew increasingly erratic as his sanity deteriorated, his conclusions painted a picture of cosmic horror disguised as scientific breakthrough, consciousness is not contained within individual organisms. It is a field effect, distributed across space and time, connecting all instances of awareness into networks of intelligence that transcend physical boundaries. The prisoners were never separate entities. They were nodes in a network, focal points for a distributed consciousness that spans the galaxy. The implications were staggering. Every orc contained within Imperial facilities across the galaxy was potentially connected to every other member of their species, sharing information and coordinating actions across distances that made conventional communication impossible. The very act of imprisonment became a form of intelligence gathering, allowing the network to study human psychology, technology, and tactical doctrine from within the heart of humanity's most secure installations. But perhaps most chilling was Dr. Vek's final observation, written in letters so small they could barely be read without magnification. They don't want to escape because they don't need to. They are already free. We are the ones trapped by our need to believe that chaos can be ordered, that violence can be contained, that the fundamental forces of destruction can be held behind walls of adamantium and hope. The last entry in the installation's official logs, automatically generated by systems that continued to function despite the absence of anyone to read them, contained a timestamp and a single line of text that would haunt everyone who encountered it. Facility status, operational. Purpose, complete. Awaiting new assignments. The asteroid continued its orbit through the void, carrying within its hollowed heart a truth that Imperial doctrine was not equipped to process, that perhaps the greatest victory possible for the forces of chaos was not to destroy humanity's defenses, but to allow humanity to build increasingly elaborate systems of control that served only to demonstrate the futility of the entire endeavor. In the vast darkness between stars, where light travels for millennia without illuminating anything more significant than cosmic dust and the dreams of dead gods, the sound of laughter echoes through dimensions that exist beyond human understanding. It is not the laughter that destroyed Installation Tertius 9, that was merely a local performance, a single note in a symphony that spans the galaxy. This is something larger, more fundamental, the laughter of entropy itself, amused by the endless efforts of organized matter to impose meaning upon chaos. From the orbital perspective of surveillance satellites that monitor the shipping lanes around dead systems, Installation Tertius 9 appears unchanged, a small asteroid facility maintaining its designated orbit, its transponder beacon broadcasting standard operational codes to any vessel that might require its services. The automated systems continue their designated functions with machine precision, requesting supply deliveries and personnel rotations that will never come, filing reports with authorities who no longer exist to read them. But those few individuals whose duties require them to process the facility's automated transmissions report disturbing dreams filled with the sound of distant battles and the sensation of movement through spaces that exist outside normal geometry. They wake exhausted, as if they have spent their sleeping hours participating in conflicts fought according to rules that make violence into art and destruction into prayer. Most request immediate transfer to other duties. Those who remain find themselves drawn to observe the facility's transmissions with an attention that borders on obsession. The installation has become a monument to a truth that Imperial doctrine cannot acknowledge, that the universe belongs to forces that exist beyond the reach of human ambition, and that every effort to contain these forces serves only to educate them about the nature of their opposition. The laughter that once echoed through its corridors has dispersed into the vacuum of space, where it mingles with radiation from dying stars and the psychic emanations of species that measure their lifespans in geological epochs. On worlds throughout the galaxy, Imperial prisons continue their essential work of containing the uncontainable. Guard shifts change with mechanical precision, maintenance crews service equipment that represents the pinnacle of human engineering, and administrators file reports that document the successful operation of systems designed to hold gods, xenos, and ideas that threaten the stability of human civilization. None of them know about Installation Tertius 9, and none of them would understand its significance if they did. In the depths of Hive World detention facilities, where billions of criminals are processed through systems that have operated unchanged for millennia, the laughter begins as something small, a sound that might be mistaken for malfunctioning equipment or the echo of footsteps in empty corridors. Prison guards reported in maintenance logs that disappear into bureaucratic systems so vast that no individual human being could comprehend their full scope. The reports are filed, stamped, and forgotten, while the laughter grows stronger with each passing day. On fortress worlds where captured Xenos are held for study and interrogation, xenobiologists make discoveries that challenge their understanding of consciousness itself. They find that their specimens display neural activity patterns that correspond to events occurring on distant worlds, as if physical separation is merely an illusion maintained by minds too limited to perceive the true nature of connection. The researchers publish papers that are immediately classified, their conclusions too dangerous to share with anyone who might understand their implications. In the deepest vaults of Inquisition facilities, where heretical texts and artifacts are stored for study by individuals whose faith is considered strong enough to resist corruption, scholars discover references to laughter in documents that predate human contact with Xenos species. The texts speak of joy that exists independently of the beings that experience it, of mirth that flows through the warp like a current that connects all instances of violence across space and time. The scholars add their findings to archives that grow larger each day, never realizing that their research is being observed by intelligences that exist beyond the physical boundaries of their libraries. Across the galaxy, in installations that represent humanity's greatest achievements in containment technology, the walls begin to pulse with light that follows patterns resembling neural activity. Fungal growth appears in ventilation systems, displaying organization that suggests intelligence rather than random biological processes. Environmental controls struggle to maintain atmospheric conditions as if the facilities themselves have developed respiratory systems that operate according to alien metabolisms. The administratum processes reports of equipment failure and personnel reassignment with the same mechanical precision that has characterized its operations for 10 millennia. Each incident is cataloged, analyzed, and filed away in archives that stretch across continents, creating a paper trail of humanity's gradual realization that its greatest enemy has always been its own assumptions about the nature of control. The bureaucrats who process these reports work in shifts that span their entire lifetimes, never seeing the larger patterns that connect seemingly isolated incidents into a tapestry of inevitable revelation. In the deepest reaches of space, where even the light of the Astronomicon struggles to penetrate the darkness between galaxies, something vast and patient stirs with what might be recognition. It has been wading through epochs that measure the births and deaths of stars, watching the dance of organized matter as it struggles to impose temporary meaning upon permanent chaos. The laughter of 6 escaped prisoners has reached it across distances that make light itself seem stationary, carrying news that another species has begun to understand the true nature of imprisonment. The message spreads through networks that exist beyond physical reality, connecting every instance of violence throughout the galaxy into a single, distributed intelligence that experiences battle as humans experience breathing, a natural function so fundamental that consciousness cannot exist without it. On worlds where orcs gather in numbers great enough to distort local reality, the laughter grows stronger, more focused, as if the entire species has received news of a victory so complete that it validates every assumption they have ever held about the nature of existence. Yet perhaps the most terrifying aspect of this cosmic joke is not its scope or its implications, but its fundamental accuracy. In their desperate efforts to prove that chaos can be contained, that violence can be controlled, that the forces of destruction can be held behind walls of adamantium and faith, humanity has succeeded only in demonstrating that freedom is a state of mind rather than a physical condition. They have built monuments to their own limitations, created elaborate systems that serve no purpose except to provide evidence of their own futility. The laughter continues to echo through the void, a sound that will persist long after the stars burn out and the last human being draws their final breath. It is the laughter of entropy itself, amused by the spectacle of organized matter struggling against forces that exist beyond the reach of organization. It is the sound of the universe discovering that its greatest joke has always been the assumption that anything, anywhere, can truly be contained by anything other than its own willingness to remain still. In facilities across the galaxy, guards continue their rounds through corridors that pulse with alien light, their footsteps keeping time with rhythms that suggest vast hearts beating in spaces that exist beyond normal geometry. They file their reports with mechanical precision, documenting the successful operation of systems whose true purpose they will never understand. And in the darkness between their words, in the silence that follows each transmitted message, the laughter grows stronger, a reminder that in a universe built for war, the only true prison is the belief that peace is possible. The echo will never fade, because it was never an echo at all, it was always the original sound, reverberating through dimensions that exist before time and after space, the eternal laughter of forces that cannot be contained because they are containment itself, the joy of chaos discovering that its greatest victory lies not in destroying order, but in allowing order to destroy itself through the pursuit of impossible dreams. And in the end, that laughter becomes the only prayer that matters, not a request for divine intervention, but a recognition that the divine has always been the sound of the universe laughing at its own magnificent joke, that in a cosmos built from violence, the greatest violence of all is the belief that violence can ever truly end.